Before we sit back and enjoy today's conversation, I want to take a brief moment to talk about an alternative way that you can support the humanitarian projects that our nonprofit organization, Better Burma, carries out. This is through the unique line of merchandise offered through our platform. These products showcase the incredible work of talented contemporary Burmese artists. You can explore our Burma-themed collection, and this features t-shirts, hoodies, caps, bags, and more, all designed to celebrate the culture and creativity of Myanmar. Not only that, but each purchase supports our mission and helps bring these stories to life. Take a look and find your favorite piece. You can check out our fundraising shop and our merch at betterburma.org and place your order today. Thank you, and let's get into the show. On this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast, we welcome Tony Waters. Tony, thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you for having me.
Tony, you have a varied background in Myanmar, and we'll get into some of those separate aspects of how your past has intersected with different parts of Myanmar's recent history. Before we get there, can you tell us a bit about your background and how Myanmar started to come into your orbit?
Well, I was a American Peace Corps volunteer in Pra in northern Thailand in 1980 to 82, so it's a long time ago. And after that, I was 22 to 24 when I was in the Peace Corps, and after that, I worked in refugee camps in Thailand for a little over a year. I really liked living in Thailand. I learned to speak Thai, uh, became very comfortable there. So after the Peace Corps, I worked in Nan province, where they had some refugee camps for Laotian people, and then in Panat Nikhom in Chonburi province, where they had a big transit camp. And I mostly worked in uh, project management. My background at that time was in biology. I have a master's in biology, which I had gotten just before I went to Thailand. And then from there, I wanted to go to another country. I ended up going to Tanzania for a little over 3 years, and I worked with refugees there as well. But that was a settlement program in a remote area of Tanzania, and I had a great time there too. I learned to speak Swahili. I met my wife. We got married there. She's from Germany, which is where we are now. And then she wanted me to go back to school and to get into academics, and so I went back, and I had hopes of studying anthropology, but I couldn't get into the anthropology program at UC Davis. And one of the deans there recommended I try sociology, and so that's what I did. And I spent 6 years studying sociology and writing a dissertation about refugee relief programs and how they work and don't work. And it's called Bureaucratizing the Good Samaritan, is the book that came out about that subject 10 years later. And then back to Tanzania for a couple of years with the Rwanda relief operation, while still kind of wanting to go back to Thailand at some point. And I wanted to show my wife what Thailand was like. In the meantime, we had kids, and never quite got back to Thailand until 2000. Well, first I had a career as an academic in the Department of Sociology at California State University, Chico. And then about 2010, my wife and we started going back to Thailand in the summers. First was we meant to first go with students, but then the coup happened. One of the coups happened in Thailand, in 2010, and that was when the department store downtown in Bangkok was burned. And the program, the exchange student program, was canceled. My wife and I, we decided to go anyway. We hung out in Chiang Mai for about a month and had a great time. And then we started coming back summer after summer until the summer of 2015. I was asked to apply for a job, and it was 2014. I applied for a job at Payap University. They were setting up a peace studies program. And in January 2016, I started teaching part-time or full-time and part-time at the Peace Studies program at Payap in Chiang Mai. And I was there for most of 6 years. I was back in California accumulating retirement points at points, but probably 2/3 of the time I was in Chiang Mai, working mainly with students from Myanmar during the period when the NLD was the government. And they were very, very interested, of course, in their own country. And so I started talking with them and working with them on their PhD dissertations. And that's how I learned about Myanmar. I visited probably 6 or 7 times during that time, usually with to see students. We hang out in Mandalay and Yangon. Uh, Others I would see in Masot, where the Karen camps are. And that's kind of how I got started. Unlike with Thai, I never learned to speak Myanmar language or Karen. Uh, but I really like my students. They're very thoughtful, insightful people, and just getting to know them was a really wonderful experience. Becoming interested in the issues they were interested in, and so forth.
Thanks for that initial introduction. And so you're bringing a multidiscipline, multinational background approach into where you start intersecting with issues relating to Myanmar, and certainly anything we're looking at in the past number of decades in Myanmar history is going to be quite interesting, quite tumultuous, quite a draw on many people who start to get closer to the gravity of Myanmar and pulling you in and wanting to know more and do more and help more with the situation as it occurs. And so you mentioned how your initial interest and inquiry into Myanmar was these graduate students that you were working with in Thailand. And then, so that's what starts to bring you into more of an interest in Myanmar. What parts of the Myanmar experience or sectors did you then start to develop a further interest in inquiry and activities in?
Uh, well, first of all, mainly I'm a sociologist, and so I'm not a historian, though I do tend towards social history. I don't go into archives very much. I do it once in a while, and I don't speak the Burmese language, like I mentioned. But I'm mainly a sociologist and have a strong interest in Thailand. In many ways, I feel more comfortable in Thailand because I can speak the language and I get around there. But my students, they all had this, intense interest in peace. Many of them had worked with NGOs or with the Western press, and they were saying, what is it that's wrong with our country? And as a sociologist, I started to wonder, why are they framing it that way? And learning more and more about how they saw things and trying to help them express their views in ways that are more analytical and less, less advocacy, but say, okay, what is it about Myanmar, both inside the country, but also in its place in the world, which has meant that it's had such a long history of fighting and war. Yet, despite this, my students, they had a very strong sense that we're good people too. I love my family. I love speaking the Burmese language or the Karen language or whatever language it is, the Shan language. What is it that? Why is it that we have so many great problems? And each student, my interest tended to go with what the students were interested in. So I had two students who are from the Karen refugee community outside of Masot. One of them who worked very intensely with education services and so forth. And so in his case, he wrote his dissertation about how the Karen education system emerged, why it was important, and why it is an expression of Karen nationalism. And the other one was more of had more of a historical basis. And who are the Karen people? Why do we have this sense of Karen nationalism. Um, what does it mean for our future in Myanmar? Why is it that we don't seem to mix well with the Burmese military in particular? The both of them were mainly critical of the military, though they did feel like they had a separate sense of Shan nationalism. On the other hand, I had a third Karen student who was from Yangon, and he had grown up in the Irrawaddy River Delta before moving to Yangon as a boy, and he felt very strongly he was Karen, but he also felt very strongly he was Burmese. And he says, I love reading novels. He's a big reader of novels, and he loved action books. When he was a boy, I used to read those and devour those, and I could read better than my Myanmar Burmese classmates, and it was a wonderful. And there was another student. She's a journalist living in Chiang Mai now, from Myanmar, and she was very interested in Aung San Suu Kyi and her role in trying to create a nation and trying to understand her role and how it emerges from how Burmese people see the world. And then there was another one who was an economist. She was interested in mass op business areas, and it would go on and on with people like that. So as a PhD advisor, you spend a lot of time sitting in coffee shops talking about dissertation proposals and ideas and trying to match it with broader literature from sociology and history. And I had a great time. And then also the trips to Myanmar, I took it probably 6 or 7 times, and meeting with the students there. They showed me Mandalay, and I once went to Naypyidaw, once to King Tung, and several times to Yangon.
That's great, and I really enjoy the experience you mentioned of talking dissertations, reading what people are writing, going through research. I think that's something that I really enjoy as well that we do on the podcast, is to be able to take some of these more academic topics that are coming from scholars and find a way to talk about them and treat them in a way that without all the footnotes and the hardcore dry research, which has a more limited audience that's able to access that, but just really get into these topics that are coming from these dissertations. Why do they matter, and how are they relevant to just an ordinary person that is interested or living or involved in these issues? Because I think that that's something that sometimes academia, more elite levels of academia, miss, is trying to get the core ideas of what that research is doing to then inform and engage and hear back from those that aren't in those academic circles. And so I think this is also a great chance to check in with you of, coming from being able to be in both worlds, both, the world of the academic research that's being undertaken, as well as the world of just sitting around a tea shop talking about stuff and trying to figure stuff out and trying to answer, what essentially is this tragic question you frame this with of why is my country so broken, but then all the history that goes back into Karen identity and formation of KNU and educational systems and identity and everything else. And so I wonder if you could just give us like a snapshot or a reflection for our listeners to digest and reflect upon about some of the interesting things that you would learn and discuss and engage with about your students as they were doing these dissertations.
Okay, I'll start first with, I can go through each of the dissertations, but I'll start with a book came out last year based on the dissertation of Sa Etu. And Sa Etu was the Karen student from Myanmar, and he had grown up during the Ne Win times, and then during the Slork times, and then on into as the military retained control. He was someone who was a Karen Christian, grew up in Yangon, got his master's degree in theology from Myanmar Institute of Theology, but he was the one who also loved being a Burmese person. He's the one who had moved to Yangon when he was, I don't know, 12 or 13. In 1988 had come along, and he kind of tagged along on the demonstrations at the edge. His father wanted to keep him back, and he felt like the problem was he placed the problem at Ne Win's feet, General Ne Win's feet, and saying that what General Ne Win had done was attempt to quote unquote Burmanize Myanmar. And Saw A2 felt that that was the big mistake. That was the major problem. Then he went into the details of what Burmanization meant to him as a Karen boy growing up in the system. First of all, going to school for the first time, not speaking Burmese until he was 7 or 8, and learned it in school and was exposed only to Burmese at school after having been to a church school, a Karen school, for a couple of years, and how difficult that was. And then entering into the culture in Yangon, where he learned that he was the enemy from his school lessons, that the Karen were the enemy, even though he knew the Karen side of the story, which his grandfather had told him when he was growing up. He lived with his grandfathers for some period in the Irrawaddy Delta, and him trying to reconcile these stories. And on top of that, his love for Burmese philosophy and literature, uh, not so much the movies, perhaps, because the Karen were often the enemy in during the Ne Win period in the films that were produced. But the richness of the Burmese culture, the philosophy. He knew a lot about Buddhism, and he had a great deal of appreciation for Buddhism. And so out of that, came this idea that, which he got from the ethnic minorities, that the problem was that we have been Burmanized. The difference was, he said, this was actually an explicit policy which came from the Ne Win regime starting in 1962. And what he found out from his research was that Ne Win's assistants had, in fact, been prepared for this in a unit called the Psychological Warfare Unit of PsyOps, Psychological Operations, which was sponsored in the 1950s and developed by Ne Win when he was the commanding general of the Myanmar Army. And he had developed his PsyOps operation by sending his people to the Philippines, where the Americans trained them in psychological operations, which they had used extensively in the Philippines to clear villages, convince them that they should come over to the government side and so forth, and using anti-insurgency doctrine to do so. And the anti-insurgency doctrine they adopted, of course, when they came to power in 1962, would become the Four Cuts operations. The idea that you had to move the people, concentrate them, take away their old way of life, cut off all things that the insurgencies could possibly use. It was the Four Cuts. I don't know them off the top of my head right at the moment, but you have to cut off all their supplies, their weapons. You have to cut off their access to the people, and that these Four Cuts operations, which in many respects are still the doctrine of the Tatmadaw of the Burmese army. It's what they use going into Rakhine right now, or into Shan State, or Karenni State, Karen State. They still use these doctrines to try to control the territory, which have their basis in Ne Win's military doctrines from the 1950s and 1960s.
Now, just to clarify, you're mentioning how the four-cut strategy was drawn on inspiration from what the Americans were doing in the Philippines. I haven't heard that before. If memory serves me right, I thought I'd heard that that this was similar to what the British themselves had actually done during the Second Boer War of around, I think that was 1899 to 1902. That some of the strategies they were using there was borrowed from the military. So were they drawing from inspiration in different places, did you find?
Yeah. And my other student, Dr. Monmo Miat, who actually took my job at Payap University, she's teaching there now, and she's with the Democratic Voice of Burma. She traces a lot of the democratic philosophy that Aung San Suu Kyi brought back to that period as well, before the British. The British had their they call them pacification programs, which were anti-insurgency programs. The Japanese did it even more brutally. And of course, the Japanese trained the Myanmar Tatmadaw during the World War II. And many of their training doctrines come from the Japanese. PsyOps was also similar to anti-insurgency doctrine, which was also used by the Americans in Vietnam, and probably in Laos, not Laos, Afghanistan and Iraq. The idea that the army has to go in there and control the territory, go through and get out the bad guys, and then set it back on whatever route the army wants. This kind of anti-insurgency doctrine, the British probably started it. We're just working on was a book by Claire Claire Hammond, uh, the book about the railways on the shadow tracks. She wrote about that very clearly, saying that the doctrine started with the British. It's Myanmar, in my view, has been the victim of Great War politics since the 1800s. And there still are, there's a struggle in Myanmar over who's going to be the patron, China, the United States, and Thailand, or whether in Myanmar consistently, whether it was the military government, the NLD has always said we want to stand on our own, we want to be separate, we want to be our own country. We don't like the Chinese, we don't want the involved. We like the Americans, perhaps. We don't want the CIA, um, and that's kind of the problem. That's probably 2/3 of the problem. Usually, the outsiders frame it as being, well, these people just can't get along, but they can't get along in an environment in which outsiders continually play a major role.
Yeah, certainly. And even just the irony of constantly hearing a neighbor like China describing how they should, that there shouldn't be so much outside interference in Myanmar's internal decisions, and yet they're some of the greatest outside interference that's been at play for decades. And as you're
Yeah.
describing the military drawing, this is just seems like kind of the worst and most sinister of the different um, past historical examples they could draw upon. British colonial oppression, the Imperial Japanese Army, the covert undercover CIA operations, and so you're just describing in across each of these how they're pooling different aspects of really their multi-decade-long trail of oppression and brutality towards their own people. And I know this also gets into another topic that you've become interested in and researching, which we natural segue to, which is the CIA involvement in Burma. That's been something you've looked at. And so what would you like to share here of how you got involved in that topic, and then what you've learned over the years of how the CIA has been involved in past decades in Burma?
Well, I'm not really an expert on it, especially after I listened to Patrick Wynn talk on your program last night, from the old interview, that he really knows what he's talking about. There's some other authors who are like that as well. Bertolt Lintner. It's interesting how journalists have played such a great role, a very positive role in describing what happens in Myanmar, because academics don't have the same kind of access. Journalists are somehow more willing to go under the wire and do things semi-legally in order to get the story. But I mean, I'm American, so there's a natural interest, I think, probably in saying what is going on here. When I was in the Peace Corps, um, it was at the time the Kun Sa, the big drug dealer, he had actually his headquarters at the time was actually in Thailand. I think it was in 1981 or 82. The Thai government decided to put an end to that. First, they tried to assassinate him the old-fashioned way, and when that didn't work, they sent because the commandos who went in to kill Kun Sa got killed themselves. Uh, Shortly after that, the Thai government just said, "You're getting off our territory," and they sent about 1,000 men, and they pushed him out of Chiang Mai and back into Myanmar across the border. And at that time, I was living in Prague, and I had a buddy who was in the Peace Corps in Chiang Rai, and so he was evacuated to my house because the Thai didn't want him to be in the region while they're undergoing this operation, because they knew that him as an American, he could be a subject for kidnapping, or so they thought, and so he was evacuated. He hung out at my house for about a week. So that's how I became interested, I guess. And then just reading about it, Alfred Crosby is the classic book on that. The politics of heroin in Southeast Asia. He makes the case that the Americans, well, he makes the case, that the Americans were encouraging the production of opium in the 1950s and 1960s before they turned on the production of opium after 1972, when the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, was developed. Uh, that tension between DEA, this is again Patrick Wynn and others, DEA and CIA continued on probably up till today, but definitely in the 1990s, where the CIA has had a long-term interest in being anti-communist and anti-China, having operations and allies in Myanmar who will help, and the role of the DEA, who are law enforcement, and want to arrest the bad guys or whoever they define as the bad guys. So it's more of a side interest. I think my greater interest is actually in the sociology of the international politics, because it's not just the Americans who are doing this; it's also the Chinese. And I don't read Chinese, and so I don't have the same access to the whatever is being written in Chinese about the region, which would be interesting because Chinese involvement there is ancient. They had the silver mines in Bodwin in the 18th, 19th century. A lot of the silver of China came from there. They abandoned those, and then in the mid 19th century, during the century when China had so much chaos during the post-opium war period, uh, and I'm sure there's things written about that as well, And then the Chinese later being involved both as a merchant minority and with the fall of the what KMT, the Kuomintang government, and the groups. I listened to the podcast last night, and Patrick Wynn said they don't think of themselves as KMT, but the Chinese soldiers who retreated from southern China into northern Myanmar and said, look, and set up pseudo states down there and developed the opium trade in the 1950s and 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and then the Burmese Communist Party, which was supported by China. So I'm sure there's a great story to be told by someone who can read Chinese or speak to Chinese people. Um, and it's amazing, how involved outsiders have been and how unsuccessful they've been in reaching their goals. The United States has not eradicated drugs. The Chinese have not been able to build their railway. Um, and it's despite all the power that both have brought to those tasks.
Interesting, though, unsuccessful in reaching their goals and yet perhaps successful in destabilizing the country.
I don't think that was their goal, but that's certainly what happened. On a certain level, I'm working on another book right now about Highland Northern Burma and the politics of the region. And it strikes me as, they're unsuccessful in reaching their goals. Their goal is to stabilize the region for their goals, trade and dominance of trade in Burma by China. The United States has a concern about, democracy and human rights and controlling the drug trade. And certainly they have not been successful in reaching those goals. But, Kun Sa and Olive Young, what's her name? Olive, the opium queen, Olive, they were successful in reaching their goals. Kun Sa ended up retiring and going to Bangkok. Maybe that was his goal, and he left behind, military, which had just kind of floated away from him, but they show up with Wa State. Their goal is, this is again something, because I listened to Patrick Wynn on your podcast. He said, I try to avoid assigning good and evil. And I think there's a lot of reason to try not to do that if you want to understand. When I'm writing this book, I'm wondering, why is it that mothers and fathers in northern Burma, year after year, time after time, send their sons off to join these little nasty army, or quote unquote armies? What do they see in the world that makes that so attractive? I don't think they're going there to, I want to be the biggest drug dealer in the world. They go in and they say, well, what are our alternatives? What is the context for what's going on here? And they see all these little armies floating around northern Burma. And they've been floating there for decades, if not centuries. They were the KKY units that Kun Sa first got started with in the 1950s. There was all the little ethnic armies that come and go. They're very ephemeral. They come, they go. What happened to them? And the West comes back. You signed a contract. You signed a peace treaty, a ceasefire, but then the group that signed the ceasefire is no longer in existence. There's a whole Wikipedia page dedicated to groups that have signed ceasefires in northern Myanmar, most of which no longer exist. But what does exist are these small armies. The KKY was one term, border guard forces is another. Um, TOT was in the 1920s in Myanmar. The British tried to set up small armies in villages. Those are called TOT, like in Tatmadaw. Tatmadaw is the royal army. The TOT are the small units that were set up in independent. I mentioned BGFs. PDFs are, in effect, homegrown military units who can be very tough, very nasty. They can be warlords. That's another word. Dacoits was the old British word. It goes on and on. Why are these units so important, and why are they so persistent? That's the real sociological question for me. Not whether they're evil or whether they're good. Is why are they always there?
And when you say that some of the covert activity that has been occurring in Burma these past decades by foreign powers, that their goal might not have been destabilization, and yet that's what occurred. I think the point there is also that in looking at and trying to understand, again, answer this question that you posed at the beginning when coming from your students: why is my country so broken? What are the causes of it? That if you're not looking at this covert foreign interference that has occurred for so long, then you're ascribing reasons and rationales to other things that are occurring outside of all of this influence that's been taking place, perhaps under the surface.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the reasons why I think that's important to look at. And in your own analysis and looking at and trying to understand what effect this has had going back, since the British days, and how and to what degree this destabilization has occurred, and to answer the question that you just asked now, or to respond to it, this sense of why are all of these in all of these ethnic regions, these small militias. Why are so many joining these that, as you say, sometimes not so long later don't even exist? And so, what answer did you find to that?
I'm still working on that, but I think it is a product of the type of self-defense units you'll find all over the world before there was a modern bureaucratic rule that did not start with the Europeans, but was spread by the Europeans the last 500s. Bureaucratic rules started, and institutions of bureaucratic rules started with the Egyptians and the Chinese. Um, and a bureaucratic rule is impersonal, and the government is always there. And it was the same government was yesterday and the day before, and so forth. Northern Myanmar has never had a stable government, where the people had some kind of national sense of this is our government and it's legitimate and we're loyal to it, and we don't like it. I'm an American. It sounds like you are too. Um, we don't like our government, but yeah, it's our government. We'll live with it. I know Thai people who feel the same way. They don't like the military government. They may love the king, but they get frustrated with the government, and that's why Thailand has so many coups. But they still view the civil service and the government decisions about land use and health and education as legitimate. And yeah, it's good that we have it. We don't like politicians, and we don't like civil servants, but we're not going to go and revolt over it because we have to have someone who organizes the country. And that level of consciousness has never been reached in Myanmar, Highland Myanmar especially. The idea that okay, and they have reached the idea that well, this military commander will protect us. They do organize some things that keep it protect us, because if we don't have that military commander, the other military commander is going to cut off our head, or they're going to come attack. They're going to, or the Tatmadaw from the lowlands may come up here and capture our men and make them soldiers, steal our rice, and take our women down to the palace. So we better have someone like Kun Sa, because the alternative, from their perspective, is anarchy. Now, the other people view the Chinese and the Americans, the Tatmadaw all view what goes on with Kun Sa and Olive Yang and the others as anarchy. But that's your choice. But those loyalties come and go. There's a great quote that from Kun Sa I picked out. He says there's no long-term enemies or friends. You always can change. And if you look at his personal history, or Olive Young, is they were with different groups across their life. They were fantastic leaders and so forth, but they went from one group to another group to another group. Sometimes they were friends with the Chinese or with the Tatmadaw. Sometimes they were enemies, but they can let that go. And that's what bugs the bureaucrats, the ones who come from the CIA or the DEA or the Chinese, I'm sure, are bugged the same way. Um, I will say something interesting, because if we're not making judgments about the CIA, they had some fantastic agents who had a very strong sense for how Northern Highland Burma worked. And they were able to work in ways that are really quite amazing. And William Young is probably the best known uh, of the CIA agents who worked across northern Myanmar and Laos for, I don't know, 40 or 50 years. He was born there into a missionary family. Tony Poe, he worked mainly in Laos. He's also someone who had a very strong sense for how these places work and how alliances are made and what they're good for and what they're not good for, and able to interface with the bureaucracies that paid for them, the CIA and the DEA or whoever.
Those are interesting case studies. Just to pause on a moment, especially your association or knowledge with these individuals and their career. What can you tell us about what they were doing in their CIA post, and why you suggest that they were? What about their activities gave you the understanding that they kind of knew what they were doing and were well entrenched there?
Well, like William Young is, again, probably the best known. There's a scholar, journalist, David Lawitz, who's been studying his career for years and has published very little. He published one article in this journal, the Siam Society, but he's done a mountain of research. And William Young, was born in, I think, in Kengtung or Kunming, to a missionary family. He was third generation living in the area. He spoke the local languages. He had a native-like feel for the people, and he had the connections with the OSS through his family, the OSS, which organized the Kachin and the others to oppose the Japanese during World War II. And then when it became the CIA, he was associated with them. And he would travel around the highlands going from, village to village in ways that others were afraid to or could not because they didn't have the language skills, the cultural skills. And he would say, okay, look, your future is probably is with the Americans. His grandfather had been a charismatic leader who was considered a prophet by the Wa in southern China. I think, again, that's in, I keep returning to Patrick Wynne because he wrote about that group that William Young organized. And he had this kind of feel for how it would work. Tony Poe was another. I would probably I haven't met him, but I've heard a lot about him, is David Eubank of the Free Burma Rangers. He's capable of going into Burma as an American missionary, a missionary soldier, whatever it is, and setting up these Free Burma Ranger units. He has a gut level feeling for that, and he has it for the American church world, which believes the Baptists, they have this onward Christian soldiers kind of ethic, which is strong. And they have the personality for it. They have the feel for alliances. And you can agree or disagree about whether it's good or not, but they really knew what they were doing. The ones that CIA agents who are sitting down in Yangon at the embassy or some kind of front probably don't have that feel. They're there to report on what's going on in Burma, and they send reports back to Washington, and they do their 3 years or 5 years posting, and then they're gone. But someone like William Young, he was there for 50 years, and he actually broke with the CIA in the 1970s because he thought they were being too brutal with some of the military attacks in northern Laos and the raids that they were organizing into southern China.
A couple other names I would throw out there that may be lesser known. One from the 1950s, John Coleman, was a CIA agent in Thailand who left the agency on actually a spiritual quest to want to learn from the great spiritual teachers across Asia, and ended up learning from Sayagyi U Ba Khin, Vipassana meditation in Burma, and was through his spiritual potential as judged by Uba Khin, was actually one of a handful of teachers who was licensed. And John Coleman, ex-CIA agent in Thailand, started to become was one of the early carriers of the whole mindfulness meditation movement from Burma to the rest of the world. Not so well known, that story in the CIA annuals. Yeah, another name I would throw out there is Wes Kingsley, who actually was a guest on this podcast, who married Sunda Khin, who is the daughter of U Chan Tun, who is the first Supreme Court Justice of Burma and also wrote the Constitution and of Burma and the newly dependent Burma. And Wes Kingsley was there. He was also involved in the Vietnam War and was there in I think it was in 1974, the controversy surrounding the funeral of U Thant. Another interesting perspective to bring on there. And another guest I'd like to reference that is not so much from a CIA background, but from before that, from the British colonial period, is we had on historian Robert Lyman. And he has looked at the colonial period, especially in the Naga Hills and some of the ethnic regions around the Indian border, and pushes back against some of the blanket thinking about the colonial experience in Burma, describing how there were some people in the administration, especially in the ethnic areas that were British colonials, that were very interested in preserving culture and equal rights and human rights and trying to understand these ethnic local communities that hadn't had contact with the outside world and help them protect their traditions. And so there's a bit of nuance there to explore and to try to understand. Yeah. It's not all one thing really sometimes.
That's the advantage of saying I'm not looking for good and evil, I'm looking for the story, and try to understand the processes. The other one I would mention from the British was really interesting is James George Scott, who was there. There's a book, The Pants People, I believe it's called, written about 20 years ago, about his story of, he was in Myanmar as a journalist, like another journalist, starting in the 1880s, I believe, and went on to become a British colonial officer. He organized some of the sometimes brutal pacification campaigns, but he was always a writer as well. He did have a British point of view. Claire Hammond writes quite a bit about him on the Shadow Tracks as well. Organizing, he was someone who had a great cultural feeling. He also introduced, this is from the Pants People, soccer or football to the Highlands. They love football. That's great, but he also organized the British government there. That period when they were almost constant revolt just after independence. I have met, because the Tatmadaw is so widely disliked and hated across the ethnic areas because of the Four Cuts campaigns, which are, like we were discussing, British inspired in some ways. They talk about with some warmth the British period, and it's all this nuance, that you have to acknowledge, and which often doesn't get acknowledged in newspaper articles, because too newspaper articles are one thing, but they're not there for nuance. They're there for 1,500 words and out. And newspapers are incredibly important as communication tools, but they are not nuanced. That's for books and for podcasts, especially podcasts that last 2 hours.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And speaking of books, you wrote an article in Small Wars Journal, How Memoirs by American Officials Leave the CIA Out of U.S. Policy in Burma. And you review a number of books on here, several of which we've actually had interviews with the authors of those books on our platform. And in your article, you critique how as these books have looked at U.S. policy and U.S. activity in Burma, they've left out the elephant in the room, which is DEA and especially CIA involvement. And so can you share a bit about some of the arguments you were making in that article and the critiques you have of leaving out this information when talking about U.S. policy in Burma?
Well, the books are one's by Scott Marcial, the former ambassador to Burma. The other one is by Erin Murphy, who was CIA desk officer for Burma from about 2008 to 2012, and then she was the one who organized from the State Department, Hillary Clinton's quick visit to Myanmar in 2011 or 12. And the third one was by Amaryllis Fox, who is now Amaryllis Fox Kennedy. And she told her story of being a CIA agent for about 10 years, mostly not in Myanmar. Her Myanmar connection was she says she went as an 18-year-old to Massot and then was snuck into Yangon, posing as a tourist, and interviewed Aung San Suu Kyi in about 2000 or 1999, so at a period when she was under some sort of detention, uh, and made quite a dramatic story out of it for the book. And then the fourth one was Barry Broman, who was the CIA station chief in Yangon in the 1990s, working with the generals. He loved you could tell from his writing, he really loved Myanmar. Uh, he became a travel writer, and he published some things through National Geographic and other types of human interest stories about corners of Myanmar, which normal journalists didn't have access to, but he did apparently because of his connections he established with the generals when he was with the CIA in Yangon. So those are the four, and there are people who have or should have great stories and great understandings about what the consequences of this long CIA involvement in Burma are, which all Myanmar people are well aware of. They know the CIA's been there. They know about the problems are. The CIA was at the center of Ne Win's propaganda films, saying we have to be careful, we have to lock down because the CIA is trying to destabilize us. And that went on, as long as Ne Win was around from 1962 onwards. Before that, the OSS and the CIA were deeply involved, and all that history is left out of all the four of those books. And as much as I like Erin Murphy's book, she tells some great stories of how the hurricane typhoon 2007 2008, how the typhoon operation was organized, and how frustrated the outsiders were because the Myanmar generals were, I agree with her, cruel and not permitting relief goods to come in. But the one part of the problem was that the United States wanted to deliver relief goods with the Seventh Fleet. And the Seventh Fleet across Asia has a bad reputation for being the source of war. And so, the U.S. was the U.S. ambassador at the time, and went to the president and said, "Can you send the Seventh Fleet here to deliver relief goods?" And the president said, "Sure, President Bush, that's a good idea." And the generals, of course, went, "What? That's the Seventh Fleet, which supported the Pakistanis in the Bangladesh Revolution. That's the Seventh Fleet that supported the American bombings of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The Seventh Fleet that was even more recently bombing Afghanistan and Iraq." It's like a tone deafness, but some of these CIA officers who are not like William Young uh, seem to have. And so that's what my article in uh, Small Wars Journal was about how can you leave this out? It's a critique of that point. All four of the books had their strengths, but that wasn't my point, because I think the CIA is perfectly capable of celebrating their strengths. And they do, and they send people to podcast into New York City and Washington think tank events. So this is my way of saying, hey, wait a minute, these people maybe have a point to make, but they're also leaving out like the elephant in the room, which is that the United States has sponsored CIA in Myanmar since 1942 with the OSS and after. Um, the Oddly enough, there's a statue at the U.S. Embassy in Yangon, which is a huge compound, supposedly providing consular services and visas, which you can't get. But it's a huge compound, and you really don't know who works there. You're in Chiang Mai, right? You've seen the construction of the new U.S. consulate there over the last 4 or 5 years. It's a huge building. There's 172 desks in there, and I can barely get a passport out of them, as an American. So what are those 172 desks for? And then you never get a clear answer. And that's the bigger story. And um, you know, and I did go once to when the American Consul General, they invited all Americans to come and meet the new Consul General. I went to that. There's probably 60 or 70 people there. all of them saying, why can't I get my social security checks more easily? Why can't I get a passport more easily? Why does my wife have so much trouble getting a visa? These kinds of questions. He couldn't deal with those because he said he had too small of a staff. He only had 6 or 7 actual consular staff. So what are the other 165 doing? And the answer is, that there's a lot of DEA chairs probably there, and military attaches and people like that. But those are kept under the table. And again, and I think that is this bigger story that's left out of those books. And that's my point. I was glad the Small Wars Journal was willing to publish it because they're focused on military issues. It's a very unusual essay for them.
Right. I'm not sure to what degree you're looped in or have been paying attention post-coup. From what I've heard, there's very limited DEA presence in Myanmar, really just wanting to survey and have some basic understanding of what's going on with the vast narcotics increase. And from people I've spoken to, almost zero CIA presence and interest right now in Burma. Of course, this is just what I've heard through a couple sources I know that are tapped in, so take it for what you will. Have you heard anything or gleaned anything about current CIA or DEA involvement in Burma post-coup?
No, I would. I don't have any good contacts with the CIA or the DEA. I know mainly the literature that goes around it and putting it together as a sociologist. There's the Burma Act, which provided $200 or $300 million, is probably being dispersed through some of those desks. You don't know exactly how it's being dispersed because if you look on the State Department, USAID's website, it's redacted. The information is redacted about which NGOs, mostly, not 100%, but 90% of them are. Money goes to an international NGO. This one goes to an American NGO to do this task, and you're not quite sure where all the money is going. So there's a lot of. I suspect that some of the officers working with that are there, but I mean, probably your guess is better than mine about where those desks would go and what they're for and what they're doing. I assume there's quite a bit of liaison with the Thai government and the military, especially. The Thai military is powerful still in Thailand, and there's been a long, long relationship between the Thai military and the American military.
Right. Just to touch upon another feature of this kind of covert history going back in time, because it's a period I find so fascinating, is the 1950s in Burma, because this was a period of Cold War tensions that were heightened. Burma, as they often say, Burma was so non-aligned that it refused to even join the non-aligned movement. And it became this hotbed of activity and this is when, Vice President Nixon went, there were top Russian ballet troops that went, there were, there's Chinese opera, there were American athletes and jazz musicians and astronauts, all of this soft power that was pouring in. This is where the USIS, still existing today, the American Center, first came. In this time, it was really a Cold War operation that one of the few places left in Burma that I worked at, the American Center. I was a trainer there when back some years ago, and I think there's just so much interesting intrigue in thinking about, because this was one of the countries in the world at that time that was the geopolitical importance was obviously very high in terms of where it was located and what the potential was and which direction it could go, and it was up for grabs. And so because of that, a lot of attention in the 1950s through soft power, and probably a lot of other ways as well that we're still finding out about, went in trying to influence Burma to lean on one side or the other. And of course, you don't just have Russian and Western, American and British interests in there. You also have the Chinese, which are not exactly aligned with the Russians at the time. And just a lot of stuff going on in that parliamentary democracy period before the 1962 coup. And the book that really highlights this and comes to mind for me, which I just found absolutely enthralling and incredible. I'm not sure if you've read it. I believe it's called Inside a Soviet Embassy, and it's about the defection of a Soviet KGB officer to the Americans. And describing, and the defection itself is interesting, but what's really fascinating is describing what it was like to be in Rangoon and Burma at that time, and what it was like to be a KGB officer, and describing the Russian, British, Chinese, American influence all happening simultaneous at that time. And so from whatever literature you've gleaned and whatever research you've done, this period, the 1950s, what's interested you or come out about that time?
Well, I think some of those same issues, that's the UNU period mostly. Number one, the point you made at first is really important, is that Myanmar has always been fiercely independent. General Aung San, would not join the British Commonwealth. Um, he said, we're done with the British, go have your Commonwealth. We're going to have our own country. And then he was killed. Then his follower, UNU, was made president. And he was also fiercely independent. Um, he was also dealing with the Cold War, and the balancing he was doing was, a lot between China and the United States, because the Chinese Revolution ended in 1949. Some of the old Kuomintang groups retreated into Myanmar. Most of them went to Taiwan, but they maintained some connection, and the OSS and then the CIA supported them because they were saying, hey, we can go back to southern China, we can invade and take it back from the communists. So that was all 1950s stuff. And UNU was balancing from a fairly weak position where he didn't have complete control of the highlands, trying to tamp down some of the rebellion that had come from the Karen especially, which he was doing fairly successfully, as Saw A2, my student, was explained. He was a big UNU fan. And meanwhile, the U.S. is, setting up their embassy and reestablishing their connections using William Young, among others. And but Myanmar successfully said, I didn't realize they hadn't joined the non-aligned movement because it was aligned. That's a good way to look at it. But they also put forward a candidate to be Secretary General of the United Nations, and he was successful. That was U Thant. Right? That's quite a position for. They were so non-aligned that both the Americans, the Chinese, and the Soviet Union could all agree he could be Secretary General. In 1961. 1962, of course, Ne Win put a stop to all that because UNU in 1961 had permitted the communist Chinese, who were the sworn enemy of the Americans and of Burma, to come in, and they invaded northern Burma briefly in order to expel the old Kuomintang soldiers. And so there was a deal made that the KMT would take their soldiers back to Taiwan via Chiang Mai. And then they withdrew. And then, Ne Win was just apoplectic, apparently, because he's saying, what are you doing? You're letting in red, communist Chinese. They are Chinese. We don't like Chinese. And so he held his coup in 1962 during the ballet performance from the Chinese embassy. And that was all the soft power you were talking about. The Chinese were there. The Americans were there. William Young was there. And that was and he just closed down Burma. So we're going to remove ourselves from the world. We don't want any of these people involved. We're going to try and expel them all. Saw A2 always talked about, he said Ne Win had a military mindset, and that was a big part of his problem. He says he expected military discipline from his people, and that's not how you run a country. So he commanded everybody to stop fighting and submit to the army, and they didn't do it, of course. And the insurgencies got worse in the north in the 1960s and 1970s, and that habitus is the big sociology, where that habitus of revolt and dislike emerged and was reinforced and continues to be reinforced today.
That's right, and I think that's a great segue into another main area of your interest in Burma, which we haven't mentioned yet, and that's your critique of the way that aid is administered there, and international actors and development. Mm-hmm. And so, as you've just charted this history ahead of Ne Win closing the country, becoming isolationist, kicking out all this international influence, and then having this disastrous economic plan, which just destroyed the country in every aspect, destroyed the economy, the food security, the conflict went up, the education system was gutted, just on and on and on. It went from being this jewel of the Orient, this place in the 1950s, which was, Rangoon was the hub of international flights that would go anywhere across Asia, and the university system was, along with Calcutta, was seen as one of the great places to send your kids to study, and it was the rice bowl of Asia, producing food. All of
Yeah.
these things just went to hell with Ne Win's reign, and then especially after 1988, when it got back in the Western eye, at least, regarding the human rights violations and the democracy movement, then you start to have the aid and development industry, which has been a mainstay till now. And you've been quite critical of the involvement in aid workers and development that has taken place there. So, can you share some of your concerns and criticisms of how you think that the involvement has been somewhat self-serving and not as effective as it could be?
Yeah, that goes back to what I mentioned. I was in Tanzania early on in the podcast, and I wrote a book called "Bureaucratizing the Good Samaritan." And I'm very supportive of humanitarian efforts and aid and things like that, but I'm also critical. Um, that criticism was intensified by all the discussions I had with my students in Chiang Mai, because they would tell me these stories of the NGOs, the governments they had worked with, and their incapacity to see things from a Burmese perspective. Uh, but these were Myanmar students, people who had watched the Americans and the others do some incredibly stupid things, putting money in towards things, towards people, towards programs, which may have been harmless or harmful, or may have even done some good, and they cannot be criticized. And then the students were often involved in the aid industry, where you're supposed to do evaluation reports. But on an evaluation report, the way the aid industry is structured, it's hard to be critical, because the evaluation report is supposed to lead to the next grant. And the grant has to address the needs of the donor. What does the donor want to fund? The Americans are interested in security and anti-drug stuff. The French are interested. I forget what they would say, but the Canadians are interested in gender and women's in issues. The British are interested in forestry, and Germans are interested in anything green and involving federalism, because they're a federal country. Canadians love federalism. And all the aid agencies start off with these assumptions, and that's really the wrong assumption. Nobody's asking, well, what is the nature of Myanmar? What kind of government can they have that will be considered legitimate by Myanmar's people? Instead of saying we have this, these programs, and this is what we want. And so, because most of my writing about Myanmar with this respect has not been in books and sociology, it's been in the newspaper, the Irrawaddy. So I've written probably 20 or 30 columns for the Irrawaddy, mostly dealing with aid issues or books that have been published. And it's so easy to pick up something, from a student and say, why is it this way? There was one of the first ones I wrote was a woman had gone on to an American woman had gone to an American women's magazine and written about the hard life of being an aid worker in Yangon on $48,000 a year. And it got into the press and it got into the NGO culture, and everybody kind of said, "Who is that? Well, that sounds weird." And so that was one of the early ones I wrote, was a critique of her and her worldview, which involved, going to the French embassy to watch the vagina monologues, which was something that was appalled Myanmar people. But there was something very Western to do, and she trying to preserve her way of life on her $48,000 a year, and with trips to Singapore and all the cool stuff you can do with that kind of money, and still not having any money in the end, because you're an aid worker. My favorite story is it was slipped to me by a person who did a lot of consultancies. Is opium is produced legally in the world. There's 3 countries that have licenses to produce opium. They are Australia, Turkey, and India, not Myanmar. And so the question came up: is that if Australia really wants to help Myanmar, why don't they give them their license to produce opium? Opium's a great place to, Myanmar's a great place to produce legal opium. Why not give it to them? But the Australians, of course, don't think about that. They want to keep their monopoly.
Right. So you describe how the aid industry is bloated, how it's self-serving,
Yeah.
how it's not quite fulfilling its mission to want to ameliorate and do better. Do you do you see? Would you characterize that as? And I know this is a general statement, so feel free to unpack and break this down. But to what extent do you think that they're just not doing as well as they could be, and and there's room for a lot more effectiveness? Or to what degree do you think they're actually not quite the force for good that they think, and they might, through their bias and misunderstanding and self-serving needs and the amount of money that's being tossed around, that they might actually be doing more harm than good despite their stated intentions and mission?
Yeah, it could be. The big problem is that, USAID or UK aid or the German aid, first they represent American, UK, and German interest. And they want to help on their terms. And because they have the money, they can do that. They go into Myanmar or other countries and they have off the shelf programs, which they say, well, you can do this peace building program. It worked in Sri Lanka or it worked in Colombia or someplace like that. Do it that way, and you'll be good as a country without taking a deep look at what is Myanmar, who are the people, how do they see the world, what does it mean to have come from a Buddhist monarchy and then 60 or 80 years of British 60 years of British colonialism. Actually, it was longer in some parts of the country. What does that mean for how people look at each other and they look at us? And those questions are never asked. Development is treated like it's a science, and it's not a science. It's an expression of political will and political national identity, and all these things which are more a humanity than a science. But they bring in an economist and sociologist and anthropologist who are able to get them information which they can then apply to their values back in Washington or Geneva, London or Berlin, Paris, wherever. And I think that is a basic problem of aid in general. And as a result, money which could be spent better is not spent well. A lot of it, like the US especially, there's in all the contracts, you have to use US agencies and US companies wherever possible, even if they're far more expensive and far more and somehow inappropriate. Um, for Myanmar is a right-hand drive country, so you can buy American cars and ship them there. So I would assume that in the American contracts, they're sending a lot of Ford and Chevys, which they can't send to East Africa or Thailand because they're left-hand drive. But first and foremost, the embassies serve their home countries, not Myanmar, and they would have to give up that mindset, which I don't know if they can do politically, to really make a success. They need to have people in there who are there for many years. Instead, the rotation on international civil service contracts is 3 or 4 years usually. So they never learn the language very deeply. They go into the embassy circuit and they talk to each other and not to sitting around on uncomfortable trains and talking to people. That book on the Shadow Tracks by Claire Hammond, which just came out. It's a wonderful story of her as a journalist riding around on the trains of Myanmar, just talking to people. And I can't imagine embassy funding that. First of all, they'll say there's a security problem. Uh, and in the end of the day, they don't do that. They don't get that insight that she has in her book for how Myanmar people view railways, which is not very positive. They view them as sites where we've been forced into labor. We had lots of forced labor was used to do it up until now, basically. The 1990s and early 2000s, her last chapter about how people were drafted to go and break stone in the mountains to build Naypyidaw is like a real eye opener.
Mm. Right. And so with all those anecdotes, and I'm also remembering some of my own when I was there. I remember at one point in Yangon there was a walking tour of the city that was sponsored by the U.S. Embassy, and I rarely went on those, but in this particular time I thought, okay, well, let's see, maybe they have a good guide and learn some things and get to explore. And part of the walking tour involves stopping for at a tea shop and typical Burmese tea shop and having a cup of tea. And as we go to sit down, for anyone who's been in Yangon or Myanmar, that they have those very small, kind of ridiculous doll-sized plastic chairs that that's typical for the Burmese tea shop. And as we go to sit down in these, all of the people I'm around with the embassy staff, they all comment on how interesting these chairs are in such a way that it's apparent that they've never seen them or used them before, which was just, absolutely baffling and shocking to me that you would live in a country and not these ubiquitous tea shop small plastic chairs that you would not take those in. You wouldn't take those in on a walk or let alone sitting on. And that would be a new experience after how many months and years in the country. That really just floored me. And I'm thinking of another example where a certain program I was doing, some officials had wanted to come and see it, but we told them that they shouldn't come with their diplomatic plates because they don't want to draw attention and locals, and so they'd have to take a taxi, and they kind of grumbled, but they went and took a taxi and in order to see the program, and they spent a bit of time reflecting out loud about the experience of riding the taxi and just across Yangon. And that was another moment of this, like, wait a second, how long? And this is, riding a taxi in Yangon is not like riding a rural train somewhere out in the ethnic hinterlands. And so, just the experience of riding this taxi across town for someone who had been in the country for however long and however many visits, and this was a completely new experience to them. This also was something that was shocking to me, just the lack of engagement and interest and firsthand experience with outside of this bubble in the country. And so one of the questions I was going to ask of you is, what if the way that they're approaching it, you've been quite critical of, and it's not being as effective as it could, I wanted to ask, well, what can they do differently? You've already somewhat provided that answer in terms of looking at talking to local people more, getting their concerns, seeing what's needed from on their side, rather than being self-serving in kind of knowing what the answers are before they do their reports. And you have articles where you talk about the reports and analyses that they prepare are really just self-perpetuating cycles of what they already want to do and just serving justifications for it. So it's this whole kind of closed feedback loop that's taking place. But you've already identified the problem as being that while these might come in the guise of doing good and providing important relief and support and engagement and empowerment to the people on the ground, the fact of the matter is, and has always been and maybe always will be, that these have to be aligned and supportive of the embassy and the country, that in furthering their goals. They're not just looking at what are, in all of their benevolence, what are the urgent needs and support the Burmese people can have, and how are we in a position to provide it, but where is there an alignment between the things that we care about in the world, and that's the more benevolent side, and the things that also further and help our interests, and that also are able to help the people somewhat as well. And so if this is the fundamental thinking in not just in Burma but the aid industry in general and how it's approached, I guess one might be pessimistic in hoping for glimmers of change and positive improvement if this is kind of already baked into the cake, so to speak.
Yeah, well, there are people who have done very well with that, and they were with the CIA. You mentioned, Robert Lyman, but I mentioned William Young and Tony Poe, and I don't completely agree with what they were doing, but those are people on the ground who have been there many, many years, um, who had a gut level feeling for the area. I wish they had been working on something besides, drug eradication and anti-communism, but those are the kinds of people there. The Americans or the foreigners who are living in the region for decades are viewed as almost like poison by some of these people, it seems to me, because we're considered, I would include myself, perhaps you as well. You've been gone native, or you know so much that you like the people, which of course I do, and that you can't represent American interests because you're somehow kind of a poison chalice because you have interest in Myanmar people or Thai people. And but what I think we have is a nuanced view. But again, that can be expressed in academics and on podcast. But to get a contract with the U.S. Embassy, I don't even try. I don't think they'd be much interested in what I know they're not much interested in what I have to say. Maybe they read what I write in the Irrawaddy. I get nasty Twitter comments now and then, back when Twitter was more popular. But it is what it is. So I move on. I do my writing and try to enjoy it. Again, the negative, being super critical and hopefully also a bit funny and poking fun at them. That's what newspapers are for, and I think it's important to do that, to poke the powerful. I mean, you've met some of these people. They wrote good books. Aaron Murphy and Scott Marcial's books are about much more than things that they've done over their lives and what they saw and what they understood. They just leave out the CIA problem. That's what I poke at. But the other parts of their books are fine. They're great. I would like to meet Scott Marcial someday. We went to UC Davis at the same time in the mid 1970s, and his experience as a diplomat in Philippines and North Korea, or no, I mean, excuse me, in Vietnam, are really interesting. But again, you cannot write a book about American involvement in the Philippines without writing about the CIA. That's where the CIA got started with John Lansdale. Is it John Lansdale? He was the lieutenant colonel who organized the Philippine government on behalf of the CIA and oppose what they called the Huck Rebellion in the 1950s, 40s and 1950s. Then he was moved to Vietnam and set up the anti-insurgency programs in South Vietnam in the 1960s. So you can't write, and you have to mention him if you're going to write about American involvement in Southeast Asia. The Ugly American is based on him, presumably. The Ugly American and The Good American by Graham Greene.
Now, staying on this development sector a little more, you also wrote a column in the Irrawaddy entitled Myanmar Civil Society, Burmanization, and the Bars and Coffee Shops of Thailand. And this is interesting because it's pointing to this trajectory of how people and agencies are trying to learn where money is going to different sectors of Myanmar. And if we back up by not just years but decades, it was really 1988 when this first got on the radar, and there was a lot of interest in the pro-democracy movement and human rights. And at that time, because so many became exiled after 88 and 90, a lot of money was going through Mesot, and that was a real hub of activity. And those that were setting up in Mesot were making the argument later, some would say critically and a bit pessimistically, that they, in order to keep themselves funded in Mesot, that some groups started to amplify the importance of what they were doing, and also dismiss the possibility of actually giving aid to Burma, saying that it wouldn't, in country that is, saying that it wouldn't be effective. 2007, 2008, Saffron and Nargis, this started to change, and the primary importance of Mesot relative to Yangon and Mandalay and throughout the country started to aid missions, and where they could spend money started to shift, and started to see that all the money didn't need to go to Mesot. There were things they actually could be doing in the country. Moved to the transition period, and of course that was the height of all of these different aid projects, to say nothing with the economy opening up and sanctions coming down. And then after the 2021 coup, there's been a real, as it's been explained to me, a real kind of paralysis and mystery among some of the donors. What do we support now? Like, look what happened to Aung San Suu Kyi. Look what happened to NLD. And is the military is just going to take power like they always do, right? And is Mesot still this hub happening? And this real question of like, where is it that we should really be putting funds into? One of the things I've heard more recently, and I've heard with a critical, more pessimistic eye again, is the focus on anything surrounding and involving the magical words of political dialogue, and anything that you can say that you're doing that are trying to bring into the room the heads of the different communities and organizations and have them talk to each other, never mind if this is actually effective, which I've been heard it rarely is, but just to show that you're convening something of this top leadership to push them towards probably your own imposed resolution and hopes of where they come together. But this brief warp speed that I've shared of my understanding of 1988 to present and to post-coup, I first want to ask if that aligns with how you've seen that development, or if you would push back against some of the characterization or go into more detail with it. And then to move to the post-coup era, and particularly this article that you wrote in the Irrawaddy that was referenced, where you talk about the conversation shifting from the new restaurants and malls of Yangon and Mandalay, and now to you center your this think piece in Chiang Mai and the
Nassau counts too. Yeah, that was written with a former student who's now studying abroad, and uses a pseudonym, and he was the one who talked about how the whole operation seemed to move out of Mandalay. It's the same people talking in the same. They just moved coffee shops from Yangon to Chiang Mai. By going to Chiang Mai, they become more isolated, even more isolated than they were when they were in Yangon. And the agenda is still being set by the donors. Nassau is the big operational center, as you were alluding to. I think Chiang Mai is where a lot of the negotiation is going on under the table. What used to be called ethnic armed groups have their officers living in Chiang Mai, and the Thai permit it and probably encourage it to a certain degree as kind of the center for where we can all talk together. In my view, the central problem is this is when you talked about we have to have political dialogue. The central problem in Myanmar is that the Tatmadaw is in charge and they are an army, and armies don't dialogue with outsiders. That's the nature of armies. The armies are interested in security first and safety for their soldiers. And as long as you have that mindset for people who are doing political tasks of governing and organizing people, you're not going to have a dialogue. Armies don't do dialogues. They defend things and they project power and they do other things, but they are not political, except maybe in Thailand. They're not very good at having dialogues, and they never have been in Myanmar. It goes back, Ne Win was a general first and foremost, and when we were writing our book, Sa Etu, his dissertation up, it was, Ne Win got his start with the Japanese army, and setting up the Japanese army set up the training camps that are still in existence today, and came with the Japanese doctrine for how to run a country, how to run an army. And that's where some of the not all of them, some of the doctrines that are still used in the Tatmadaw today come from. And as long as the Tatmadaw is there, and I think actually incapable of having a dialogue, you're going to have the continuing problem within the country. The Tatmadaw, as long as there's a foreign threat, will be strong. They can make a strong argument. Look, the foreigners are coming. The foreigners are coming. And sure enough, the Seventh Fleet is off the coast, or the Chinese are coming down from Yunnan into northern China. They're supporting the Kachin and the Hua and the other substantial armies that are in the north, and making sure that they don't die. The Thai are permitting the KNU and the Shan armies to be supplied, probably with American help. And there's a stalemate. And as long as the Tatmadaw is in charge, they're not going to have a dialogue. And as long as both the Chinese and the Americans just use it as a playground for their Cold War or their big power rivalries, they're not going to provoke the other one enough to make it overthrow the Tatmadaw. So here we are, right? The KNU, I understand, keeps asking for anti-aircraft capabilities from the Thai and the Americans, and they don't get it. The Hua state has it from the Chinese. The Hua state's fairly stable because the Tatmadaw can't bomb them as easily.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you've seen this play out tragically quite a bit longer and continuing to be the kind of stalemate and protracted conflict that it's been.
Syria fell. there's a lot of rumblings in the Myanmar community that I was talking to about, wow, this could be us, right? And I don't know. It's I wish that the Chinese and the Americans. I wrote an editorial in the Irrawaddy about this. I wish the Chinese and Americans would sit down and say, look, both of us have an interest in a stable Myanmar. Why don't we back off? Because Myanmar, whoever's been in power, whether it's NLD or Tatmadaw or UNU or Aung San, they want to be independent. They do not want foreign involvement. They've had foreign involvement since the British arrived, and that doesn't work. And the way to do that is to back off and let the Burmese negotiate about dams and railways and the other things. The Chinese went from a position of strength. I saw a podcast with Scott Marcial. He talked about that. The Americans actually getting involved with the pipeline negotiations that the Chinese want so badly to the Indian Ocean, and just making sure that they could have as strong a position as possible. So he was operating within the constraints of American policy. But as long as there's a war and the Tatmadaw needs the Chinese support, they're going to give the Chinese what they want, and not strike a good deal for Myanmar. In my mind, there's nothing inherently wrong with a railroad and a pipeline for commercial purposes operated at the benefit of the Myanmar people. But that's not what the Chinese are looking for. So, and the Americans are not willing to facilitate that. They're the other great power in the area. Maybe the India could get involved, or Bangladesh. I don't know. The Rohingya problem we haven't talked about really, but every year for the Irrawaddy for the last 6 years, I've written a editorial saying, look, the Rohingya problem is festering. It's going to create radicalization. You're going to get armies coming out of there who are going to be subject to recruitment by somebody, by Islamic extremist, or in the case as it's working out, it seems to be they're being recruited by the Tatmadaw to fight against the AA. And whose interest was that in? It's just and having that 1 million-person refugee camp down in Bangladesh is a long-term catastrophe. It's been that way in Africa. It's been that way everywhere. They've had these huge refugee camps. They're very important for humanitarian purposes, but they're not a long-term future for a rapidly growing population, which the Rohingya are when they're in the refugee camp.
You mentioning the possibility of China and the U.S. sitting down and talking and trying to find some way to work out stability in Myanmar reminds me what a past guest, Timothy McLaughlin, said when he was on, that the way the coup was developed, there's probably no one that's happy about it. Probably no one in the country, no one outside the country, maybe save Russia, that just gets to benefit from the chaos and the arms sale without it at its doorstep. But pretty much everyone else is largely unhappy and continues to be unhappy with how it continues to churn out. And I think whatever possibilities that some outside powers might be able to talk and look at some degree of common ground, even though Myanmar has never really been at the forefront of many of these international policies to prioritize that the way some other conflicts in the world are. You mentioned political will there also playing into it.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of hope for the Trump administration. I don't think they're interested. They are concerned with confronting China at some level. I haven't quite figured out what it is. I mean, the Biden administration did it too. China has become the big enemy of the United States, and they tend to cast it in Cold War terms. I think America has another set of problems in the sense that they do one thing, they have one really really big military, and so they tend to see problems around the world in military terms. Germany doesn't do that. They look at Ukraine. Germany is threatened more about Ukraine than the United States, and they do see it as a military problem in Germany, and that NATO problem. But it's not the only way they see it. I'm living in Germany now, so I tend to focus on that. They see the refugees coming in. They see the refugees going back. They start to talk about the subtleties that are involved in the press and on the TV in ways that Americans do not. And the Americans, they're dominated by a big military. Somebody said once, the American government is an insurance company with a military. It's all Social Security and Medicare and uh, and the military. That's 80% of the U.S. budget, federal budget. And so until the Americans see that differently, I don't have a lot of hope for them. But, again, I liked it when I watched Scott Marcial on a podcast, and but I don't think they're listening to him. He said something along the lines of, why are the Americans lecturing the Southeast Asians about China? The Southeast Asians have lived next to China forever. They know about China. They don't need advice from the Americans. And that was from a former American diplomat, and he knows it.
Right. Now, one of the things that might have put the whole country in a better situation that you also have past columns that are writing about and analyzing, again, critically looking at this, is the nationwide ceasefire agreement, which was attempted during the transition period. So what can you tell us about the way that the NCA was conducted and your criticisms and concerns with where it could have been more effective?
Well, I think part of the problem with the NCA and all the ceasefire agreements in Myanmar is that some of the groups that they were negotiating with were ephemeral. They're here today, gone tomorrow. Some of them are pretty permanent. The KIA and the KNU, maybe some of the Shan groups. Those are institutionalized, and they are developing their own bureaucracies. I mentioned Hai Sotako, who's one of my former students. He wrote about the Korean education systems that have been there since the 80s. A lot of them had developed in the Thai refugee camps. Another student, Saw Alwyn, wrote about the role of history among the Korean that's being taught in those schools. And it's a very different history than that's taught in those schools. And there has to be some respect that, the KNU is different than the DKBA or some of the other more ephemeral groups. And putting them all on equal footing because they all represent groups that the West has defined as being is not effective, I don't think. You can always find someone like the Kun Sa would be one. You can sign an agreement with him. It's not going to be good because he's not going to be in charge. And his soldiers, they had that huge surrender ceremony in 1996 where everybody came out and they laid down 7,000 guns and 12,000 soldiers surrendered. And then they let them go and they just reformed into WASD. And maybe some of them went to the KIA or whatever. It was totally ineffective as a ceasefire. It wasn't a surrender. It was a show put on for the CIA. And the Tatmadaw went along with it. And they took Kun Sa down to Yangon, and he had a nice life down there until he died, And I guess his kids they received a lot of the money. And what's his name? Lo Sing. He was another one who managed to retire to Yangon, and his son is now one of the cronies I think he's the richest man in Myanmar, with legitimate businesses, but tied in with the military like anything. And how that can be framed as a success in the war on drugs, I don't know, but the Americans seem to think so.
Well, I really appreciate all of that conversation about such a wide range of topics that you've been able to share. Have really covered a lot of decades and regions and different perspectives and analyses to look through. And so with that, I'd like to ask if you have any final comments or reflections you'd like to leave for our listeners as we wrap up here.
Well, I really appreciate the in-depth conversation we've had. It's really nice to talk to someone who knows about Myanmar history, maybe more than I do, and I really enjoyed it. Next time or another time, perhaps we can talk about philosophy. I understand you've worked with Buddhism a lot, which is a subject which is very central to Myanmar, and the the Dharma and the ways of thinking, which is not just Buddhist, but it's also in Myanmar Christianity. Has elements of habitus from Buddhism that come into Christianity and shapes worldview and makes them one people, perhaps. But that's probably for another time. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Insight Myanmar Podcast. Producing these conversations takes dedication and resources, and through this process, we're committed to keeping them freely available for everyone. But to make this work sustainable, we do need your help. If you've enjoyed this episode or found it valuable, and if you listen to our platform on any somewhat regular basis, we ask you to consider supporting us with a recurring donation. It doesn't have to be much. Think of it as buying us a cup of coffee each month. That small gesture of committing to just, $5 a month can make a big difference in helping us to continue bringing these stories. And if you're feeling more generous, increasing the monthly pledge will allow us to produce even more on our end. In any case, any level of support goes directly towards amplifying the voices and stories that matter. This not only keeps us going, but ensures that these important conversations reach more people around the world. To make a contribution, visit insightmyanmar.org/donation or look for Insight Myanmar on PayPal or Patreon.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam